Hello and welcome to Buried, presented by Defense Diaries. This is one of our bonus episodes where we give you a behind-the-scenes look at the making of and a bit of Q&A from my beautiful and brilliant co-host, Allie. What's up, girl?
Hey, babe. Hey, all. And just remember, everyone out there listening, we are doing this as a live episode, and we will take questions from our members, patrons, and others during the episode.
It's exciting. So we're going to listen to episode 2. If you were listening to it as we're dropping it on the traditional podcast feed, we are up to episode 9, so we're a bit behind here. But the hope is that this is much like a crack dealer giving free crack out to people in order to get them hooked, so that you guys will go and say, hey, well, we don't want to wait until the next time that Bob and Allie do this. So I'm going to go ahead and listen to the podcast on the podcast feed, because that, quite frankly, is where it happens to help us the most. And as much as we love YouTube, I don't know that it counts in the downloads for actual podcasts, which is how we get paid. That's how we get advertising for the regular podcast. So it's a tricky endeavor, but we want to try to keep everybody happy. We saw that there were a bunch of people that enjoyed this, and frankly, I enjoy doing it as well. So I think with that, let's get cracking on episode 2.
Okay, and then I just want to say before we start it that this would be a horrible way to be the first time you're listening to the episode. It's interrupted, there's no flow. And I think if you have listened to the episode and you're watching live and want to ask questions, you're going to be in a much better place to do that because you'll kind of have digested it all. So yeah, let's begin.
Welcome to Buried, inside the John Wayne Gacy investigation, presented by Defense Diaries. I'm your host, Bob Motta. In this episode, we will focus on the noose tightening around Gacy's neck as opposed to his victims, as we look at the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest and the ensuing investigation conducted by the Des Plaines police as they begin zeroing in on their suspect. I'm compelled to warn you that this episode contains disturbing and graphic content about the taking of a human life. So please exercise caution. This is episode 2.
When we were driving down to
On December 11th, 1978, Robert Piest, affectionately referred to by friends and family as Robbie, was working as a stock boy after school at Nissan Pharmacy, which was a small chain located in the Chicagoland area. He worked there part-time as he was saving money to buy his first car when he turned 16. This was a milestone that, sadly, he would never reach.
When I had left the drugstore, first of all, I arrived at the drugstore at 5:30, left at 7 o'clock. When I come home at 7 o'clock, I did some Valium. But I only think I did 2 10 milligram Valiums. Then I went back because I would have never gone back to the store. They called me up and told me that my book was there, and then I decided to go back. Because when I originally was there with my car. I had no intention of going back there. In fact, I was at my house. I cleared the tape off. When I cleared the tape off, there was a call from Larry Torf for his brother, stating that I had left my Bible.
Gacy's contracting company, PDM, was doing a remodeling job on the store. During this time frame, Robbie overheard the guy who was overseeing the work being done tell Larry Torf, the owner, that he'd be hiring people for the summer to work for him at $5 an hour. Robbie didn't approach the man at that point to inquire about a job, which in retrospect, if he had, he may have never ended up in Gacy's clutches. At about 8:30 p.m., Robbie saw the construction guy had returned and thought to himself that this was a great opportunity to ask the man about a job. At about 8:47, Robbie's mom walks into the store. She was coming to pick him up from work so they could go home and celebrate her birthday with the rest of the family. At that point, Robbie noticed that the contractor was leaving the store. And not wanting to blow the opportunity to talk to him, Robbie asked Kim Byers, a coworker, to give him back his winter jacket, as she had borrowed it a bit earlier in the evening because the register was near the front door of the store, and the cold air blasts were too much for her to handle. Keep this small detail in mind, as this particular exchange happens to lead to one of the major breaks in the case. As Robbie was running out of the muted.
I'm just going to pause there because I want to point out, without any spoilers, Robert Michael Motta, that as we've discussed before, explain to the people how this is all happening in real time, and as it develops, your whole perspective can change.
Yeah.
Oh,
well,
I'm sorry. And for those of you watching on YouTube, we also have some photographs that I'll play while Bob's talking, which include Robbie Peast, the pharmacy, and for now, the missing photo that was put up when Rob went missing. So go ahead, babe.
Okay, so there's a few things here that were interesting. So when I got to episode 2, and I want to tell a little bit of a story that I've told in a couple of places. I don't think that I've told you guys. So when I started the podcast, I had never spoken on a microphone before, right? And I had, however, over the course of 20 years, tried many cases in front of juries. And I had never felt any kind of anxiety once I started, like, say, a closing argument, where, in that situation, I have somebody's life and or liberty on the line, like literally. And I never felt any kind of anxiousness or anxiety or nervousness. And the first time that I got on the mic and I put on the headphones, and Darren was sitting behind in our studio behind the half wall, and he had his big 2 monitors up, and he's working the sound. And as soon as I started speaking, I got super, super nervous. Like it was bizarre for me. It was such a weird experience because I have never done that. And you can hear every deep breath you can take, or that you are taking. You hear every whistling S, you hear every mouth noise you're making. So it was really weird. And I was really, really self-conscious about it. Like, and you can hear, as this is my first podcast that I had ever done, the difference between episode 1 and by the time I get to episode 3 and beyond, my comfort level in terms of narrating the podcast grew exponentially. And that only came with getting used to it. And Darren saying, "Hey man, don't worry about all that shit, all the breaths, all the whistling S's. I'll get rid of all that." So that was a big thing for me. That was a really, really big thing for me moving forward, because, when you are recording like that, you are hyper conscious about all those things, because ultimately you want the podcast to sound good. So that was one thing. And then specifically to Allison's question, as she had stated, going into it, when episode 1 was done, I'm like, all right, like I have a framework. Okay. And then I really started to figure out here in episode 2, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through all of the police reports, and I'm going to go through this chronologically, except for Peast. And I'm going to start with Peast because he was Gacy's last victim, and then move forward. But what I wanted to do with this particular episode is I tried to write the script in such a way that it flowed perfectly with the things that we knew that Gacy was saying about his abduction and ultimate murder of Rob Peast. So I tried to craft this particular script into a thing where I'm telling the story, and then all of a sudden we switch to a Gacy clip where he's telling what happened that night. So that's how this thing was supposed to flow. And I think that we did a pretty good job with it. The reality is that Gacy talked about the actual homicides of only 5 of his victims. He didn't talk about all 33 of them because, as you'll see as you go throughout the season, he basically continues to say that he forgets. He conveniently forgets everything. So as we progress, again, you're going to hear things in the earlier episodes where I talk about things that I plan on doing and things that I think are important based on the old narrative of the Gacy case that I come to find out in the very near future directly from the cops that we start interviewing that it wasn't the case. So at that point in time, like right around episode 6, I have to reverse course completely as I realize that this has turned into not just an exercise in retelling the story that we all knew, but in a different way, but that it had become an investigation into what had actually happened and how they actually got Gacy after 10 days. And that only came after I started talking to the cops, which again, is a few episodes down the road. So you'll hear this thing actually, because again, it was a real-time investigation. We were producing these podcast episodes right after doing interviews in a given week. I'd write the scripts and then I'd go down, we'd record. Darren would do all the post-production. He'd put the clips of all the interviews that we did, fit them into the right places, clip in the Gacy tapes, and then we'd come up with an ended episode, a full and complete and fully produced episode that we would then put out that week. So it was a real race against time, and it was exhausting. Like this thing, it's 36 plus 3 episodes, or 33 plus 3 episodes. And, it took every bit of that. I say it's 15 months, maybe it was longer. Like I honestly don't even remember how long it took me to make it. It was such a long experience that it's really kind of, and this is frankly the shortest episode by far. Episode 2, Allison, she saw it. She's like, oh, 33 minutes. I'm like, did he forget something? Is something left out? I'm like, no, I think this was actually the shortest episode, but because we wanted to really tailor this one specifically to Rob Peast, and that was just how the timing of it worked out.
Right, and I think it's fair to say that as we just heard the narrative you started to tell, you were going off of that the narrative that has been told all along is the right narrative.
Right.
And then you see that develop in future episodes, but as I said, we won't give any spoilers.
And I had no reason to know. I mean, everything that has ever been done on this case had always put forth the receipt in Rob's jacket and then found in Gacy's garbage, which leads to the second warrant. And that's when they discover the bodies. That had always been the story forever and ever. And it wasn't until our podcast that things changed. So,
all right, let's resume.
Oh, I was going to tell you before you start, the one good thing about Apple Pods or Spotify is you can put the transcript up as it's going through.
I'm sorry, but we are using Patreon so that we don't have commercials.
Okay. People did like being able to read the words though, but okay. Where is it? We can't hear it or see it.
Ooh. All right, sorry for all those. Hopefully Darren can edit this live. Because I am switching between sharing images and I had to switch to one PDF. I had to remove the whole thing. So I
You
was
could
listening
totally
to it.
tell that Allie thought it was up and we were all listening. She's taking
Right.
drinks of water and shit.
All right, hold on. Let me get us back where we were.
Classic tech wizardry.
Okay.
2
Sorry, guys.
hours later.
All right. Now, here we go, right where we left off.
Keep this small detail in mind, as this particular exchange happens to lead to one of the major breaks in the case. As Robbie was running out of the store, he told his mom, "Wait here for a few minutes because I got to see a contractor about a job that's paying $5 an hour." Robbie rushed out of the store before the man could drive away. That moment in time would be the last that Mrs. Peast would ever see her beautiful boy alive.
I left the store at 8:50. I drove away from front of the drugstore and parked in front of the restaurant. He came out and walked over to the truck. He was talking to me on the outside of the truck. I had invited him in the truck. And in the truck was going on, he had a little time. I said, well, I gotta make a stop and then I'll be coming back up to school. So he rode with me to the house. That I remember. Came to the house. From this pharmacy over to my house, it's got to take. First of all, we didn't leave, and it had to be 9 o'clock because I think the news was on the radio when we were driving down to it. We didn't get to my house until about 9:15, 9:20. I know that I had 3 or 4 phone calls. And I cleared the answering service twice in that period of time. I talked to the electrical contractor. I talked to the plumbing contractor. Max Gus's. I can't think of who the electrician was. I had talked to somebody else. Talked to Raphael. Raphael wanted to know why I was out of his house yet because I told him that I hadn't gotten there yet. He had talked about a summer job. And I told him that I didn't know if I could hire him at all. That we should wait till summer comes. And then I don't know. I told him there was other ways he could make money. If that's what he was interested in. He didn't like the idea. We didn't get into the idea. We were discussing some sex. Well, then he put the handcuffs on himself. He put the handcuffs on himself. Okay, I of course expounded further on him getting blown, and he didn't like the idea. And then he was scared that he was going to get killed. I don't know. He said he wanted to go home because he thought someone said he thought that I was going to harm him. So why would you say that? You know.
Back at the drugstore, Robbie's mother waited and waited, ultimately leaving to head home without her son.
What happened next?
I don't remember.
How was he killed?
Strangulation.
The rope trick. Or you put the rope on his neck. Did you have sex with him?
No. He was, he was falling on the. We laid on the side of the bed because then I had to leave. The phone was ringing again, but the answering service was on. And I had to clear the answering service. When I cleared the answering service, this is Johnny, this is Aunt Leon. We're on our way to the hospital. We're on our way to the hospital. They called us about Uncle Harold. I went and changed my shirt and grabbed my jacket. I changed my pants and shirt, grabbed my jacket, got in the car, and took off. Now, this had to be 10:15 or so when I took off.
And he was dead.
Yeah.
Did he have his clothes on?
Yeah.
You remember the actual killing? You remember
No.
strangling him?
No.
You remember carrying him into the bedroom?
No, he walked in the bedroom.
Why?
I told him that's where the key for the handcuffs were. We wanted the handcuffs.
Is that when you killed him in the bedroom?
Yeah.
From behind or in front of him?
No, standing right next to him.
Did he struggle?
He fell on the floor. See, all I did is, after the rope, he was standing there when I put the rope around his neck. He was standing right there. Because all I said, I want to show you something. But then I don't remember. I think he fell on the floor, because that's when the phone rang, because I left.
Who was it? It was your aunt?
No, the answering service had covered it. But then I had to go clear the answering service up to find out who called.
So the phone was ringing while you were killing him.
Yeah, I think so.
At around 11:30 p.m., consumed with fraught and worry, she calls the police to report her son missing.
So obviously what stands out most to me, and first I want to highlight one of our member Kasharak's comments. I hate how he's like, they put the handcuffs on themselves. So it's all on them, you effing douche. And that's a theme here. Like he absolutely does that. Well, they put the handcuffs on themselves. Well, they came over knowing full well what was going to happen at my house. Like, what do you mean full well? They knew about the drugs, the sex, but did they? And I sure as shit don't think they knew about the murders. But is that what did you make of his coldness, the way he just describes the phone calls and, oh, I had to deal with the answering service. He's almost more upset that he's got to stop the murder of this young boy to go deal with the answering service. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I think, probably going to be the biggest takeaway after you kind of make it through the whole series is that this guy just was devoid of any kind of human emotion. Like he did not operate like normal people. Even people that aren't necessarily empathetic can still have feelings. And Gacy was incapable of feeling anything other than for himself. Like he was that much of a narcissist and he was that much of a sociopath where he literally didn't ever think about the ramifications of what he was doing. He didn't think about the pain that he was causing to these families and their loved ones and just everyone that they came in contact with, speaking of the victims. And yeah, his thing was always to shift the blame to the victims. He always was, well, they were going to out me if if I didn't pay them money, they were going to tell people that I was gay and I couldn't have that, or they were trying to extort me for money, and instead of paying them, I would kill them. And he'd say it just like that. And then when you talk about Rob Peast, which again was his last victim, Rob was the last boy that fell victim to Gacy, and he went completely against his typical MO, wherein he put himself in a position to where he was seen in close proximity to the victim shortly before that victim disappears. And he'd never done that. I mean, he would typically, if it was one of the kids that was out hustling, he would go down to Bug House Square and he'd pick them up, or he'd go down by around the lake where kids would congregate down there and he'd pick them up. And this was always 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. He'd get them into the car, either by force or by offering them drugs, alcohol. We'll go back to my house, we'll party. I got a party house. There's always people over there, and these kids would hop in. Again, different times, right? I mean, and this was something that worked for him repeatedly, time after time after time after time. Because if you remember in episode 1, I mean, Gacy talks about if he has to try to put a number on the number of partners that he'd have during the course of a year, he'd come up with crazy numbers, like numbers when you're doing the math that don't even add up, like some Wilt like Wilt Chamberlain type shit, like 1,000, but per year. So it's, but Gacy was a compulsive liar. He lied about everything. This guy couldn't tell the truth. He was a braggart. He was a chameleon. He was everything that made for him being, in my estimation, the scariest apex predator of all time, because of the fact that he was so open and notorious in public. Like I talked about it the other night with like BTK and some of these other killers who were married, had jobs, were kind of out in the public sphere, and hiding in plain sight. Like there was no aspect of Gacy where he was hiding. He was out there. He was inviting people to his home all the time. He had huge parties. So all those kind of things. So, when you sit there and you start thinking about Gacy, and as I listened to the tapes when I was producing this podcast and writing the scripts, I really came to realize that at this point in time in December of 1978, this fucking dude was exhausted. And I think that, and I don't remember if it was in tape 1 or episode 1, or if it's in the next few episodes. I've heard it, but he talks about when my father's going at him in terms of, what did you think or feel once you threw somebody down in that crawl space? He's like, did you think about it? Were you like, oh shit, God, I've done it again. What's going on with me? Did you have any of those feelings? And Gacy's like, no, I didn't.
I think that's coming up. But I
Yeah.
think what we did hear, I believe, in episode 1 is him talk about, and again, Bob and I are listening to these as they're released as well, because we haven't heard them in years. And Bob even forgets stuff despite the fact that he wrote it and recorded it and listened to it. But in any event, he talked about that at that period of time, he had been trying to keep himself busy so he didn't have time to go hunting.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. That's exactly what I was getting to, like that particular sentence that he says. But here with Peace, again, everything was premeditated. From the minute he laid eyes onto that handsome kid right there, when he walked into the pharmacy and Robbie was stocking shelves, Gacy saw to it that he's telling Torf, the pharmacy owner, that he's going to be hiring kids for the summer, paying $5 an hour, which is twice as much as he was making at the pharmacy. So obviously he knows that's going to catch this young guy's attention, and that this kid's probably going to come up to him and want to have a conversation with them. But Gacy also sees to it that doesn't happen at 7:30 at night. So what Gacy does intentionally is he leaves his appointment book there, which he referred to as his Bible, knowing that he was going to come back, and he was going to come back closer to closing time, so that when Robbie approached him, that he was going to be able to abduct him, take him back to his house, kill him, and just move on with his life, do what he always did. And, when he's talking about this interaction with Robbie, and you see him do it again, he does that thing where he tries to switch it and blame the victim. He's like, when Robbie said he wasn't into it in terms of me blowing him or him blowing me, and then Robbie says, oh, well, I thought you were going to hurt me. That's when Gacy decides that he has to kill him. So again, he switches the blame onto the victim.
Right, by saying, why would you think I'm going to hurt you?
Right.
Why would you think someone's going to kill you?
Right.
Well, now I'm going to kill him. So as Sarah, one of our live listeners, says, victim blaming. Yeah, he, as you'll see as the series progresses, I mean, it seems like he, like in his whatever, being, he just really does blame the victims for all of this. It's it's crazy. All right, so let's continue.
She goes on to explain to them that this is a good kid, straight A's, athlete, girlfriend. He's just not the runaway type. Something has happened, and she fears it's something sinister.
Well, what happened with that is, actually, it was at that time we dispatched officers to take reports, and it was Officer George Konitsky who who went to the and took the report. And when he got done with the report, which he would have come in, he was working 3 to 11 shift at that time, and he came in and he went to juvenile division. And, in the late 70s, kids were running away. They're constantly happening. In fact, a lot of times they weren't entered in right away into the computer, because that was, back then, was a very meticulous operation to enter anything into the computer. But when he got done with that, he made the effort to get a hold of juvenile guys and said, this is not your normal runaway. This kid is just like you just said, an all-American kid, great family life, no girlfriend problems, school problems, anything. There was just no reason for this kid. So then they started looking into it right away.
This insistence by Mrs. Peast that someone do something about her missing son cannot be overlooked, as it is the turning point in terms of Gacy's reign of terror coming to an end. The next day, December 12th at 9 a.m., the late Lieutenant Joe Kozenzak and Detective Raphael Tovar arrive at work.
But George, to his everlasting credit, he went back to the location where Robert Peast had last been and got the names of everybody that had been there that night. He did that evening. And then as things would happen, the next morning I came into work. I was the early detective, and the Peast family came into the station quite early, wanting to talk to the detectives to see what was being done. Well, the Lieutenant, Joe Kozenzak, was in his office. He comes out to my area and tells me to go get the reports.
The lieutenant learns that the missing boy had attended the same high school as his own son, which was Maine West in Des Plaines. In light of this fact, he immediately orders an investigation to start. Detectives first compile a list of all the employees that were working at Nissan Pharmacy the night before, including Larry Torf, who, if you remember from earlier, was discussing summer jobs with Gacy. Once the officers are armed with that information, it doesn't take much time for the detectives to figure out that the construction guy was John Wayne Gacy. And at about noon on the 12th, detectives show up at Gacy's house unannounced. They ring the doorbell, no answer. As police gather more and more information about Gacy, the narrative begins to change. Gacy, the businessman, community leader, and party clown who everyone seems to think is such a great guy, is a facade that begins to fade very quickly. As information about Gacy flows in, a much darker picture is being painted as day fades into night. At this point, detectives no longer view Gacy as merely a person of interest, but instead consider him to be the primary suspect in the disappearance of Robert Peast. At approximately 8 p.m. on the 12th, the police once again visit Gacy's home.
Before we get to that next part, I just want to talk about a little bit about it. I'm going to push back on you because you're always displaying so much credit for actually investigating, for actually looking into it and doing all the things that Chicago didn't do. But my pushback to that is they had the perfect victim for that. They had a family guy. They had someone from a different socioeconomic background. He had, one of them, he went to school with one of the officers' parents. So as much as we say, okay, Des Plaines really did their job, don't you think that it might not have been the same if they didn't have Rob Peast as their victim that time?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's true. And as we obviously progress through the series, I touch upon that pretty frequently because I go to great lengths to destroy the Chicago Police Department because of their utter failures. But, when I started interviewing all these cops, and I saw that you had thrown a comment up there, and that was true. Like, to a cop, they all kind of leaned in on that excuse that these kids were runaways, and there were thousands of kids that went missing in the 70s from Chicago in particular, thousands, not hundreds, thousands. And every single one of these cops that I talked to was of the mindset that back then that they believed that, most of these kids had just run away, not necessarily forever, but that they run away for a few days. They'd go to their friend's house and they'd just kind of dip on their parents and not let them know where they were. And, in a few days they'd show up. So there was always this kind of wait and see thing that would go on.
Right, but like at one of our listening members at Living Story World says, I disagree. Kids weren't just running away all the time in the 70s. Yes, a lot of them went hitchhiking for fun, but a lot were kidnapped. The police just didn't do a good job believing that. And it sounds like from what you're saying that had they not had this perfect victim, had it not been someone who went to school with one of the detectives' child, someone who had upper class parents and a good background and a job and all those things, that maybe they would have fell victim to the same type of investigation that Chicago did.
Yeah, no, and that's the comment I was talking about. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, because you had the socioeconomic aspect of it. This is a suburban kid. Okay, this is a suburban police station and police agency that's dealing with this. You're not dealing with the city of Chicago. It's a vastly different thing, and it wasn't a detective. It was the lieutenant Kozenczak. His son attended Maine North with Rob's kid, or with Robbie. His kid and Rob were at the same school, so he immediately felt that connection. Which ultimately, as I progress through the narrative, it becomes apparent that the lines that should never be blurred when police are investigating a crime get blurred, because he becomes personally invested in the case in a way that cops shouldn't. That's why cops shouldn't work their own family's homicides. It's way too close to home. They can't be objective about things. It blurs everything for them. And that was what was happening with Kozenczak. And when we come to find out what we find out, and I'm sitting there reading his book, because he had passed away by the time I was doing this podcast. So I couldn't question him, so I had to rely on his own written words that he had written, some 15, 20 years earlier, in terms of his relationship with the Peace family during this relatively short period of time. But yes, absolutely. And the other factor, babe, is Mrs. Peast. Mrs. Peast was that mom, that she was not having any cop tell her that my kid ran away. She's like, nah, that's not my kid. Like, you got the wrong one. Something happened to him and you need to fucking find out what it is. And I'm not going anywhere until you do. And she was all about that. And she never backed down from that position. And, I have to think that that's exactly how you would be and how any mama bear would be, and when you think about it in terms of how she was dealing with the Des Plaines Police Department, that's not to say that the parents from other kids that went missing weren't doing the same shit.
Because you do get into that with at least two of the other victims, that their parents were, one of the dads was calling a lot, one of the moms was calling a lot. They were saying he wouldn't leave, and we'll get to that when we get to those episodes. But Chicago had some of that.
Chicago had more than enough. More than enough.
Yeah.
They should have solved this case in 72. Easily.
And then just to go back to the last section that we played, one of our listening members at Lucy asks, so Bob, do you think he strayed from his typical MO because he was tired?
I think it was a combination of him being tired and him being overconfident. I think when you are able to get away with something that long for that period of time, and you think that you've mastered the process in terms of being able to commit these crimes and being able to evade law enforcement, that you get sloppy. And, I think it was cockiness. I think it was laziness on his part. And I think he was tired, because just understand that the way Gacy operated, he would work from 7 a.m. until 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night every day. And he would ultimately end up going out mostly every night, and he'd go hunting. And his typical kill time was between 4 and 5 in the morning. He'd get home around 3, whatever would go on with these kids, whether it was, initially consensual or it wasn't, and he had to use the handcuff trick or the rope trick to kill them. Those were all things that would happen, and then he'd sleep for a couple hours, and then he'd get up and do it again, day after day after day after day. And I saw a question earlier. Gacy was married twice. He was married back in Waterloo, Iowa, to his first wife, who he had 2 biological children with, who, as we get into later in the season, we discuss it. Darren, my producer, and I, we had long thoughts about whether or not we should reach out to Gacy's kids and see if they wanted to speak to us, because we speak to an unbelievable amount of people in this podcast. We speak to victims, like we had that monkey guy in the live the other day, who was claiming that he was, a surviving victim of Gacy, and he might have been, and I'll hear his story. I'll vet it. Timelines matter, but we had a lot of people reach out, and you're going to hear a lot of them speak in the podcast as the season progresses. But, ultimately, I just think that it was a combination of all those things, that ultimately led to his demise. And, Mrs. Peast wasn't going to let this thing go, and as we get to, without spoiling what's coming up, and I know those of you that are following along with it as we're dropping it, know what happens, know how they actually got him. But in episode 10, which is dropping tomorrow, I put it all together for everybody on why what happened and why it happened at that exact time.
Right.
There's this other thing that was taking place in this case that forced the hands of Lieutenant Joe Kozenzak and made him do what he did. And it's crazy. It's a crazy, crazy thing. And
But we'll
I'm
continue and
excited for
say
everybody to hear about, or to hear it tomorrow.
yes, but let's continue with episode 2. I'm trying to keep my man on a short leash to keep any spoilers, but you did good, babe. You did good.
Thanks, son.
All right, let's proceed.
This time, however, Gacy answers the door. Lieutenant Kozenzak informs Gacy of something that, of course, Gacy already knows, which is he is one of the last people to see Robert Peast alive. And because of that, they need him to make a statement. Gacy tells Kozenzak that he will show up at the police station, but that he can't do it right now because he just got a call from his aunt from the hospital informing him that his uncle had just passed away. Kozenzak, still insisting, says, okay, but you need to understand that since you were the last person to see him, we really, really need you to come to the station and make a statement, for the investigation. This really rubs Gacy the wrong way, as ironically, he's upset with the cavalier attitude towards a death in Gacy's family. Unbeknownst to either officer standing in Gacy's doorway is that young Robert Peast's lifeless body is stashed up in Gacy's attic. So as Kozenzak is walking away from Gacy's front door, he turns and tells Officer Summershield that he wants him to sit on the house, but probably about a block down south of the house and out of sight. Now, neither Albrecht or Tovar were present for this contact with Gacy, and they both have very, very different information concerning that surveillance that was left at Gacy's home that night.
We actually got lucky that night. I've always said, police work is a lot of hard work, but boy, we really rely on luck a lot of times. And
I'm going to pause here because Bob wants to make a comment.
Yeah. So the first cop that we heard, which we didn't kind of lead the intro into it, not in this clip here, but the first set of 2 cops that we heard that's Joe Kozenzak. But the first cop we heard was a cop named Mike Albrecht. Mike Albrecht is one of the cops that really opened up to me in terms of our interview in a way that I wasn't expecting to happen. And Mike is down on the lower right, one of the guys on his knees.
And for those of you Listening to
Navy
audio
suit.
only, we have put up a photograph of, are these all the officers, Bob, or is this the state plus the officers?
Nope, this is all Des Plaines cops. Tovar, so Mike Albrecht is with the blonde hair and the Navy suit down in the front row. Tovar, back row. He's got the tan vest, the black shirt, the glasses. He is the Hispanic-looking gentleman back there. So Tovar is who's speaking now. So Mike Albrecht and Raphael Tovar were the two first cops that we interviewed. And doing that was such a surreal thing because I was able to get their phone numbers, communicate with them. And when you're putting these calls in, you're putting together this podcast, I always would preface it by, look, I'm doing this thing. I'm not just a random dude. My dad represented Gacy. His name was Bob Motta. He was one of the lawyers. And they'd be saying, oh yeah, we knew Bob. And so like getting them to agree to it was easier than I thought that it would be going in because they had all done so many interviews in the past. And I was dead set on them telling me stories that they hadn't told, because when you watch them in all the different documentaries, they're always kind of telling the same shit. It's always the same stuff. So when I went into it, I'm like, look, man, like you got to tell me some stuff that you haven't told anybody else. And it was like I felt this kinship with these guys because, I was this, kind of tangential part of the case, in that my father had defended the guy. So it's like, and I think that they reciprocated. I think that they felt that, especially Albrecht. And, when I get to some of the other guys down the road, Tovar was just kind of like like I always described him as a professional interviewee. Like he was great. He could really just crush stories. He told some amazing stories. We used a lot of our interview with Raphael throughout the entire podcast because he just told some unbelievable stories. And if you watch Devil in Disguise, Tovar turns out being kind of the hero of the story in terms of the cop that they gave the most face time to in that series.
But what we're going to hear next is an important part of the story that no one heard. It wasn't a part of the Devil in Disguise. So let's hear where we're going now.
Because he had arrived home in the van, and Rossi, I believe, arrived in the Oldsmobile that he had. And what happened was, in the way the driveway was set up, you can't really see the cars if you're south of the house in the back. And when they followed the van thinking it was Gacy, and by the time they caught up to it, they realized it wasn't him, that he had, and there was only one car following, I believe, which is when I say we were lucky, because, had we followed Gacy in the car and found Peace's body in the trunk, the case would have been over. We had no reason to think anything else. We were looking for one person.
Well, I'm not sure which one would be the right way, but from how I recollect that I was told about it was Kozenzak and Summershield were there, and that they talked to him, and like you said, he blew him off and said, he couldn't, and they left. Kozenzak left, told Summershield to stay there, and I hadn't been aware of Rossi being there. Just that Gacy pulled out with his car, the Olds, and Summershield was trying to follow him. But one car, you can't follow anybody, especially if you're trying to be covert. And Gacy lost him very quickly.
Now, Gacy tells Kozenzak that he gets it. He needs to come in and make a statement. He guesses that he'll probably be able to get there around 11 o'clock. Well, 11 o'clock comes and goes, still no Gacy. He calls over to the police station at some point and informs them that he'll be there soon. They wait until about 1 o'clock in the morning. He's still a no-show. At that point, they decide to go home for the night. Fast forward to about 3:30 in the morning. Gacy saunters into the police station, asking for Lieutenant Kozenzak. The cop at the desk looks at the man and sees that he's covered in mud from head to toe. He tells him that Kozenzak has left for the night. It's 3:30 in the morning, and he should try to call him tomorrow. Before he can leave the building, the cop calls out to him and says, Hey, buddy, why y'all covering mud there, pal? Gacy concocts some story that he tells the cop, but you can bet your ass that it was in no way, shape, or form related to how he actually got muddy, which was from trying to push his car out of the mud that he gets stuck in when he's disposing of Rob Peace's body in the displays.
You don't recall hiding the body, or because possibly there was patrol cars or barge there, or because you were stuck. You were just stuck with the body in the trunk.
No, because I gave the guy the keys to get the car out of the
Trunk was empty.
Yeah, car was money. I fell asleep at the wheel, that's why I said I don't remember.
On December 13th, Gacy does in fact call at around 11 a.m. and says he'll come in, and as promised, Gacy shows up. He's questioned and maintains his story that he never spoke with Robert Peace, and certainly never left Nissan Pharmacy with him. Kozenzak and every other officer investigating the Peace disappearance are not buying what Gacy is selling.
All right, so we got a couple of good questions here. Louis say his St. Louis Blues 833. Sorry if I butchered that. Had asked why, or wouldn't they have gotten a warrant for his home even if they arrested him that night in the car, though? Potentially, yeah. But I mean, they end up, if you're not familiar with the story, number one, go and listen to the podcast. They get the warrant on the 13th. So they're in that house. And theoretically, had they found Peace in the trunk, if they had been able to keep the tail on Gacy and followed him all the way down, down south on 55 to where he ended up dumping Rob over the bridge, and they were able to place him under arrest at that point. And they're like, all right, well, we got to go search this guy's house and look for evidence, that he ended this kid's life in that house. They're going to find the exact same things that they found during that search. Now, whether or not they would have put together, or if they would have cared enough to put together the fact that they found the JAS class ring is unknown, because again, the John Zick investigation, if you want to call it that, was Chicago PD's jurisdiction. It wasn't, because Zick was a Chicago kid. So it wasn't their jurisdiction. They would not have continued to investigate it. But, once they had solved it, they would have gone in. They wouldn't have known to look beyond what they did on the 13th in the crawl space. They would have found the same shit that they found on the search for the 13th. And I think that probably would have been it. Now, the question of whether Ralph Tovar, and again, who you heard there was, in this order, Raphael Tovar and Mike Albrecht. So those are the two cops you just heard before I started narrating again. They had two very different stories about that night. So one of them Ralph has Mike Rossi pulling up to the house in Gacy's car after Gacy gets back with the van. Because if you remember when we were listening to the tapes, Gacy had the van with him. He called it the truck. When he brought Rob back to his place that night, on the night before. So the next night, when he ends up getting home and, they're sitting on him, and then he must have called Rossi to come over. He's like, bring my car back over here. At some point, because Summer Shield's sitting down the block, they're able to get the body into his Olds and into the trunk without anybody seeing it. Then Gacy, according to Ralph, Gacy takes off, and they think that it's Rossi because Rossi had come in that car, and then Rossi gets in the van. And Tovar's version is that Summer Shield follows the van. Albrecht's version is he doesn't have Rossi involved at any point that night at all. And ultimately, he just has Summer Shield losing him, which is a likely scenario because Gacy drove like a lunatic. You'll hear it throughout the series that Gacy was just an insane driver. It went along with everything else that Gacy was. And, ultimately he ends up down at the place where he ends up disposing of Rob's body, but he gets stuck in the mud because he pulls off the road in order to get the body out, get over to the bridge, wait until there's no traffic, and then dump him over. And he comes back to his vehicle. He can't get it out. That's how he gets the mud all over. He's trying to put some shit under his wheel so he could get out. And he ends up having to call a tow truck driver, which I get into in one of the episodes in detail in terms of that whole experience. But, you know, they were that close. I mean, when Gacy walks into the station after he's disposed of Rob's body at whatever it is, 2:33 in the morning. And, you know, you've got the guy at the desk that they're sitting there and he sees that Gacy's muddy, but this guy has no idea who he is or why he's there or why he needs to talk to Kozenzak or who Robert Piest is. So none of those things would strike a chord with that guy. And because he's not the same guy that took the call from the Piest earlier that night saying, my kid's gone missing, you guys need to do something about it. So, you know, shit's kind of going Gacy's, whoa, I don't know what that is. You know, up until it doesn't. You're muted.
I muted you there at the end to try and get rid of that sound. So you said your last sentence was what?
Oh, you know, that Gacy just was, you know, things were going his way until they didn't. But ultimately, and I had seen another good comment that I think Rob was 5'6" and about 140 pounds in that picture that we see. So, and I saw a comment in there that there's no way that Gacy would have been able to get Rob up into that attic, which might be true. And I am very much of the mindset that Mike Rossi and David Cram were accessories with Gacy, especially in the years 77, 78. So, I mean, is there a likelihood in my mind that Rossi was there and helped him get Rob up into the attic? Yes, absolutely. So,
and then came back to help him get down from the attic and into the car.
Right.
So that Gacy could leave. And I just looked back at the bulletin, the missing bulletin that was put up that we shared earlier for our live viewers. And it does say that he's 5'8" and 140 pounds. So, all right. And that was Travis Williams, Esquire, whose comment you were speaking to earlier.
Our good friend.
All right. So let's continue.
At all. As a matter of fact, while Gacy is sitting in the interrogation room with various detectives, a complaint for warrant is prepared and presented to a judge for issuance and is granted. The warrant, which was issued on December 13th, authorized a search of Gacy himself, his home at 8213 West Summerdale in Norwood Park, and 3 of his vehicles, which were a black van with PDM on the side, a black pickup with PDM on the side, and his black 79 Olds Delta 88, which looked a hell of a lot like a cop car.
If I heard the TV saying Smokey the Bear was around, a lot of people would refer to my black car as an unmarked Smokey the Bear.
Smokey the Bear.
Now here I want to talk about why that first warrant is so important. It's because this is the first opportunity that officers are going to have to be able to get into Gacy's house, not only to look for Robert Piest, who they are hoping is still alive, which they obviously don't know at that point, but if they can't find Piest himself, they can at least find some kind of evidence that shows that Piest had been in that house. In order for the police to obtain a warrant to search our homes, they must show that probable cause exists that a crime is being committed. The police, in order to show that they have probable cause, have to prepare what is called a complaint for search warrant, which is sworn on oath. Typically, the police work hand in hand with the state's attorney's office in drafting the complaint, because if it's poorly drafted or not specific enough as to what they are searching for, or does not contain enough facts that amount to probable cause, and the warrant is issued and executed, meaning that the searches take place, then, when and if the defendant is arrested, any decent defense attorney will look at this warrant and complaint post haste. If the defense attorney believes that the warrant is deficient for any of the reasons that I've stated earlier, he or she will file a motion to quash, not squash, which is commonly confused, much like moot and mute, or blood splatter and blood spatter. So a motion to quash the warrant operates to suppress all the evidence found as a result of the search conducted on the bad warrant under the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. Think of that exactly as it sounds. If the tree is rotten at its roots, the fruit that it produces will be rotten as well. So when you hear people say, he got off on a technicality, this is exactly what they're talking about. And it's not a technicality. It's actually our incredibly precious Fourth Amendment right that protects each and every one of us from unreasonable searches and seizures of our persons and homes by the government. Our founding fathers thought that that particular right was important enough to draft an amendment to the Constitution about it. And frankly, without it, we would be living in a police state where law enforcement could just show up at our homes and come in and search them unfettered. That is a scary thought. The point of me going through that little lesson was not to bore the shit out of you, and I'm sorry if I did, but instead it was to illustrate the importance of the drafting of the complaint for warrant. Because if the trial judge disagrees with the judge that issued the warrant about any aspects of that warrant, the end result is that the evidence collected could be tossed out and would not be able to be used by the state at trial. And one thing is for certain, that my father and Sam Amaranti would be scrutinizing that warrant and any that would follow in order to keep crucial evidence from being introduced into evidence at trial. As you can imagine, that type of loss of evidence would be absolutely catastrophic to the state in terms of them meeting their burden of proof to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant had committed the crime. And typically what happens in that situation is that the state nolly processes the case or dismisses it altogether. So you can see how absolutely crucial this first warrant was in getting Gacy off the streets. So I asked lead prosecutor Bill Kunkel what his impression of that first warrant was as drafted.
But it really didn't paint a basis for a connection between some of the items that they actually recovered, or even the ones that did wind up at trial, since Judge Garippo did not suppress the warrant, any evidence based on that warrant. Some of the serious pieces of evidence. Well, here's the point. If you just say, search for Robert Piest and search for evidence of the detention of Robert Piest, that's too broad. If you ask him to search for ropes and handcuffs, or whatever, if you have some basis for that, then we can argue about whether they did or not. I think you would have a basis for that in any detention, but at least put it in there. But the bottom line is there was no kind of bridge between any specific items. And that's a common problem with search warrants. And so, for instance, narcotics involved police officers and other law enforcement groups dealing in those kinds of cases, are very well schooled and very well experienced in being very specific about it. Firearms, same thing. Well, he showed me the gun and he put it back in the closet, or I went there to his apartment to buy heroin, and he got the heroin out of the top dresser drawer in a box and sold me 2 packages, so forth.
On December 13th, the Cook County Sheriff's Department and the Des Plaines Police get into Gacy's home for the first time.
So I just want to pause there so that you can speak to, and I know in future episodes you delve much deeper into the motions to suppress and the hearings, but explain to the listeners, it seemed that the attorney, the prosecutor, was saying, well, the items that they ended up seizing, and can you tell us a little bit more about that? But the items they ended up seizing weren't really tied to what they put in their warrant, although the judge upheld it.
Yeah. And so that was Bill Kunkel, who was the lead prosecutor, the guy that we heard last. And he ended up passing away, sadly, I think about 8 months after I finished the podcast. And so I felt very fortunate that I was able to speak with him. And ultimately, he ends up at the end of the series performing his entire closing argument, which is frankly mind-blowing. And I say it all the time. I don't know that there's a podcast out there ever that has had the lead prosecutor and one of the lead defense counsels in a case of this magnitude perform their actual opening and closings. It's that part of it is worth the ride in and of itself. But so, yeah, Bill was going into the fact that the specificity that was indicated in that first warrant was lacking, because what they ended up finding, again, they find a class ring that has the initials JAS. Now, obviously, that's not Rob Peast. They find a box full of these badges that aren't cop badges, but they look like cop shields, and they were for some kind of civil service thing that Gacy always volunteered for. So he has this box of those things. They find a pair of handcuffs. In the interior garbage, they end up finding a 3-foot length of rope. They also find, back in the old days when you would buy a wallet, there would be these plastic inserts where you could put your credit cards and family pictures in. I don't know if they still put those in wallets anymore, but they found those two things in the garbage. They also found several items of kind of gay pornography. They found some underwear that didn't look like it necessarily fit Gacy, but they didn't know whose it was. They found a blue parka, which wasn't Rob's jacket. And they found some other things, none of which they had asked for. And in terms of, like, to Bill Kunkel's point, you're thinking if they're trying to, solve a case that they're considering to be first and foremost an abduction, that they would have included things like the rope or handcuffs, things that you would typically think that somebody would use in order to control a victim, especially a male victim, an athletic kid. But they didn't ask for that stuff. And interestingly, which is a story that I don't think I talk about on the podcast, but I've told it a few times in various places. And I told it to my father. When I first was able to get Bill Kunkel to come on, and again, he was the lead prosecutor. There were other prosecutors, one of which is a guy named Terry Sullivan, who was a prosecutor up in Rolling Meadows in the 3rd District. He would not come on the show. I soon understood why, but the first time I ever talked to Bill Kunkel, before we hit, the button to start recording, Bill went out of his way to tell me this thing, which at the time I didn't know why he was saying it, but he kind of gives me this disclaimer. He's like, hey, it's important for you to know that I had absolutely no idea what was going on with that investigation with Desplaines up until the night that Gacy was arrested. I had nothing to do with the warrants being drafted. I had no knowledge of the investigation. I didn't even know Gacy existed in the world. I didn't know any of it. And I'm sitting there when he's saying it, and I'm like, okay. Like, I didn't get at that point in time why he was saying that to me. It would become evident to me why he said that to me about 2 weeks later when I first interview Mike Albrecht. And when
and it will become evident to you all as you continue to listen to the podcast.
Right.
All right, let's continue.
Since the killings began in 1972.
He came in to be interviewed at that time, and that's when I had probably a 2.5, 3-hour conversation with him. He had come into the station, as I said before, to be interviewed, and while they were getting the search warrant, I had entertained him because he wasn't being held, so I was just going to talk to him and try to keep him there without telling him he could leave, if you wanted. He was telling me how important he was, first of all, how he knew Walter Jacobson, and that how he had important friends. And I knew a lot of it was just BS, so I just kept saying, really? Tell me more about this. And he was in his glory, he's a big blowhard. He just kept talking. I didn't care what he said. I probably don't remember half what he said, so long as he talked and didn't go anywhere. So actually he was asked to stay at the station, and he did. He stayed there while we went.
So while Gacy's sitting in the police station, the search of his house is being conducted, and he has no clue that that's going on. All told, during that search, the police end up recovering approximately 60 items from Gacy's house, ranging from a pair of handcuffs, jewelry, including a class ring from Maine West High School with the initials JAS engraved into it, and several articles of clothing that contain what appears to be blood. But what they don't find is anything that directly links Robert Piest being inside Gacy's home. To be clear, when I say that they don't find any direct link to Robbie in the vehicles or the house, I'm saying that in terms of it being 1978, because they did find the blue parka, a green shirt, and a pair of yellow underwear, all that had possible blood stains on them. And most telling is a stretch of nylon rope that appears to have human hairs attached to it. Now, you and I both know, based on what we heard with respect to Gacy recounting the murder, that Robbie was strangled, not stabbed or shot. So the odds of the blood on the articles of clothing belonging to Robbie are slim. However, that piece of rope with the hairs that was recovered from the house, shit, that's a smoking gun. We will get back to that stretch of rope in the next episode. Sometime after the search has occurred and Gacy has left the police station, he gets back home knowing that the police have just ransacked his house. What Gacy knows at this point is that number one, they didn't find Robbie's body because it wasn't there. And two, that they didn't find anything inculpatory because, well, he was standing in his house and not in a jail cell. The following exchange between my father and Gacy drives at a bigger point, which is how concerned was Gacy that the cops may have discovered a graveyard in his crawl space.
He says, I looked down in the crawl space. The reason I went down to the crawl space is when I got in the house there was a white line was all over the goddamn quarry stone floor in my entranceway and also on the wall. It looked like they came up out of the goddamn hole after falling around down there. They had put lying all over every goddamn. I was pissed off about it. I couldn't figure out what the hell they went down the crawl space for because there was nothing down there.
But you knew there was something.
What I'm saying is in regards to they were looking for peace. Okay, there was nothing down there. Okay, there was no undisturbed ground. There was nothing. So they went down in there and they must have crawled all over it because they come up with lime all over them. They just smeared the goddamn lime all over the house. I was pissed off about that. David Cram says that I went down in the crawl space. I did not crawl around. I just crouched down and made a complete 180-degree circle and came back out, which is the truth. They asked him where else I looked. He claims I went in the attic. I don't.
Why did you go down there?
What?
Into the crawl space.
I just explained to you because it's goddamn the plastic stuff.
So what? I mean, why would you go down there? You know what I'm getting at? I mean, why did you go down
Was
there?
I going down there
To see if they discovered it.
No, that wasn't on my mind. I didn't even think of that.
So my father is asking him point blank if he went into the crawl space to see if they discovered the graveyard. And Gacy's response of, I didn't even think of that, is incredible. This guy's mind at this point has to be racing nonstop. What is very clear from this clip is that Gacy, after having survived the search of his house without them discovering his terrible secret, is only concerned with the Piest killing. He's relatively certain that he's in the clear for the other 32 people that he's murdered. So Gacy says, I didn't even think of that. Well, I guarantee not only had he thought of that, but that as soon as he walked into his house, that he made a beeline to the crawl space to see whether they had done anything other than just look around, like dig. I can't even imagine the relief that he must have felt when he saw that the cops had not been digging down there. At this point, on the 13th, I have to think that Gacy fully believed that he had gotten away with murder.
So I'm going to pause right there. You've got a question from one of our listening members at Shannon M79. Did he say lime or lie? And I know a lot of people are asking that. So go ahead and explain.
Lime. And he talks about that at some point in the tapes where people confuse lie with lime. So that summer, it's known that he had David Cram and Mike Rossi go down and spread 900 pounds of lime, Lime, down in that crawl space. So as far as, and I want people to remember that particular portion of tapes from Gacy as to when he got home from the police station after the search. And he knew that they had been down in the crawl because they had tracked the lime all through the foyer area of his house. Because what you end up finding out in episode 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, in terms of what happened on the 13th and who actually went down there, which was none of the Des Plaines police, but another guy who worked with the Cook County Sheriff's Police. He was the one who went down there. And what he ends up telling me is another big piece of the puzzle that we uncovered. And that fact that they had spread all that lime down there in the summer, coupled with the fact that all of the bodies were skeletal because he had run out of room and he was disposing of the bodies in the Des Plaines River once he ran out of room down there, really belies the fact that there would be a smell. So there was no scent of decaying flesh coming from that crawl space. And when you think about, and when you end up hearing about the second warrant and you hear the 2 grounds that they came up with in order to get back into that house after 9 days had gone by, if you start thinking about the things that were said and you start thinking about the things that you'll learn in the podcast, you'll realize exactly what happened. And you'll come to the same conclusion that I ultimately did.
And you put it all together, like you said, episodes 8, 9, and 10, and put all those connections together. And one of the things that the officers had said about the lime was that likely actually helped preserve the bodies, the bones anyway.
Right.
Over time. And then, one of the other questions I might as well bring it now because I forgot to ask you about it earlier from another listening member is at Tiff Knox. Was Rob Peast the boy who had a nice car?
No, he wasn't. So the whole point of Rob working at the pharmacy and the bigger point as to why he wanted to go talk to Gacy about the job making $5 an hour was that he was 15 at the time and he was saving to buy a car for himself. So when he turned 16, he'd be mobile. So Rob didn't have a vehicle at that time. You're talking about John Bukovich. And John Bukovich, Gacy claims is his second victim. I believe that it was his third victim. And Johnny Bukovich, his father, had called, and Allison had alluded to this earlier in this particular live, every week for 2 years, begging the Chicago police to investigate John Gacy because he was his son's boss. And he knew something was off about Gacy. And he knew that his son had been going over there to try to collect his paycheck from Gacy on the day that he ended up going missing. And nothing occurred in terms of any kind of investigation of any substance, despite this father begging the Chicago police to do something, who was, he was a first generation immigrant. And I'm talking about John Bukovich's dad. And I get pretty heavy into the Bukovich killing in episode 3. So we'll wait to talk about that at length.
Right. But Tiff had mentioned the vehicle, and that was one of the things the father focused on, that vehicle was his pride and joy. So he would not have left it behind. And as Bob said, episode 3, it's a heartbreaker. But it's into all of that. All right, let's continue.
Again. As I dug into this case much deeper than I ever had previously, one thing became crystal clear, and that is if Gacy was active, say, now, there was a 0% probability that he would have remained undetected for so long. I hazard to guess that maybe he would have gotten away with 2 or 3 murders before he was apprehended. primarily due to the fact that the tools, technology, and science that law enforcement has at its disposal now is light years ahead of what it was in 1978. There was no DNA analysis back then. That didn't become a thing until 1986, when scientists first used DNA to convict Colin Pitchfork for the rape and murder of 15-year-old Donna Ashworth over in the UK. That scientific breakthrough revolutionized forensic science as we now know it. Back in 1978, it was basically fingerprints, blood samples, hair, and fiber. And that was basically it. Now, imagine if they had found that rope with the hair on it today. It would have been rushed to the lab, and they most likely would have received the results within 24 hours, as they would have pressured the lab to get the results back to them. And don't get me wrong, DNA alone will not secure a conviction, but it is incredibly strong evidence, and certainly would have been enough to get Gacy off the streets. Now, if you're a true crime buff and things like property evidence sheets are kind of your thing, well, we've got you covered. We have uploaded copies of the original inventory sheets so that you can see everything that was recovered. It's pretty interesting, so check it out. And looking back, I can't help but feel great admiration for what law enforcement was able to accomplish in the 10 days with the limited tools that they had. There was no GPS, no social media, no surveillance cameras all over the place, constantly recording everything that we do in our daily lives. I mean, this was good old-fashioned police work, talking to witnesses, matching up stories, really digging for clues that were not readily accessible. It was really, really very impressive. And the one piece of evidence that really cracked this case wide open, well, I'm not going to tell you about that one until the next episode. So what does all this mean in summary? This means that they don't have enough evidence at that point to place Gacy under arrest. In all actuality, they aren't even close. In light of the fact that the police don't have enough to get Gacy off the street, Lieutenant Kozenzak orders 24-hour surveillance on Gacy with 2 teams, 5 officers total, which will start on December 15th. Those officers are given no instructions on how to handle the surveillance, covert or visible, or how to handle the possibility of Gacy approaching them. It matters not, though, as Gacy quickly realizes that he is being watched. Think about it. The man had literally gotten away with murder for at least 6 years. The heat is coming down on him like never before, and he is quickly realizing that he killed the wrong kid at the wrong time in the wrong town. Anyone who's been that proficient at evasion for so long is bound to know that the gig is just about up. Please make sure to join us next week for episode 3 as police close in on Gacy, and he knows it, and there's not a damn thing he can do to stop it.
All right, I was letting it play because I didn't know if you gave, a lot of times you say things at the very end there.
Yeah, not in that one.
Not in that one.
We just
Not in
called
that
it.
one.
So there
So,
it is. Episode 2.
yeah, and do you have anything you want to say in closing?
Yeah. Again, as you kind of listen to this, and when as Ali said, we're listening to this as they're dropping too, and it's wild how much of it I forgot in terms of being the creator. It's a weird thing to know that I just forgot a lot of the details. And this podcast is so densely packed with facts that there's very little, if any, kind of space fillers. It's so densely packed with information that you really have to pay attention when you're listening to it. I talked about it on the first live that we had done. If you're like me, if you're out walking your dog or you're out in your car and you're driving and you find yourself just thinking about all the shit that you have to do, or you're thinking about something going on in your life and you drift off into your mind and you come back like 7 minutes later, it would behoove you to rewind it, go back to where you started drifting off, because I assure you've missed something, because everything that I say has a purpose. And the further you get into this podcast, the more important that is to do, because as soon as I uncover the truth about how they got him, you're going to need to listen to all of it. And, people that love the podcast have listened to it multiple times because it's that kind of podcast. And, for y'all out there that are only watching on YouTube, do us a huge favor. Figure out how to get into podcasts. They're not that hard to find. They're everywhere. If you have an iPhone, it's super easy. You just have the podcast app. You open it up. You go right to Buried inside the John Wayne Gacy investigation. You click follow. You can click download, and it'll automatically download episodes on the 3 days that we're dropping them, which are Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays every week up until the thing is done. And if you're so inclined, which helps us so very much, leave a 5-star review. If you love what you're hearing, tell your friends, tell your family. If you know anybody that loves true crime, let them know that this thing exists, because you guys are our best source in terms of letting the world know that this thing exists, because how we're always asking you guys to do those things like leave ratings and reviews and make sure that you're following it. Those are the things that let the primary podcast catchers, which are Spotify and Apple Podcasts, know that people are listening, that people are enjoying it, and it puts our show on their radar. And that's when we end up getting featured on that front page, which I always give kind of the analogy to like Netflix. Like, imagine trying to find a movie that you haven't seen, that you don't know the name of. Maybe you heard something about it, but you don't know what it's called. And it's not in the top 10. It's not in For You. And it's nowhere to be found in kind of the things that they put up for you to watch, that they want you to watch, that they're always kind of directing you to do. It's the exact same thing with the podcasts on both Spotify and Apple. So it's a matter of discovery. And you guys really are our absolute like secret weapon in terms of getting the podcast discovered by the masses. I believe that it's worth it. I believe that it's worth people's time to listen to. I would put my podcast up against any podcast that exists, because I think it's that good.
Hey, and everyone's going to be in group settings for the holidays. I like to just take people's phones and be like, "Hey, can I? I'm gonna like a podcast for you. You can check it out later."
Yeah.
And then I do all the things on their phone.
She
Sometimes
did it this weekend. We were we had a couple of get-togethers at our place down in the city, our Airbnb. We had a bunch of people over. Allie was busy grabbing people's phones and following Buried all over the place, which, but I want people to listen. I truly do. And I really want people to leave reviews after they've listened to it. If it's a nitpicky thing, like, oh, I don't really like sometimes Bob does voices. Like, I read a review, like, I don't like the voices that Bob does, or I don't like the underlay of the music. Just keep that out and focus on the story, because the story is what it is.
Right.
Story is really an amazing adventure of terror and of the law and of the victims. And I think it's worth everybody's time. So hopefully you guys will all check it out. I've decided, without Allie really being allowed to have much say, that we're going to keep doing these for at least the first, I'd like, frankly, make it through the discovery, what we uncovered, because there's so much to talk about there. I think there's going to be so many questions that I'd love to be able to answer. And especially after episode 10, because it starts in 6 and it goes through 7, 8, 9, and 10. 10 is where I really put it all together in terms of why it happened the way that it did, in a way that people will be like, oh shit, well, that makes sense. Because we hear it from the cops, but I still had to vet it, and I did vet it. And we vetted it to an extent to where there was one person on the planet that is still alive that can confirm what I think actually happened, as opposed to what the cops were told happened, which was different than what they said happened all along. So I have a very different theory, but I'm not.
Let me chime in here with one more of our listening members' questions: history and homicide. Why did he put the first body in his crawl space? Was it planned or convenience for the creep? And if I may, Bob, I just want to say what I was thinking about this, because I kind of noticed how Gacy he always right away brought up about how there was a smell in that basement from when they first bought the house. There was a horrible smell. Ask the neighbors. Everybody knows about this smell, this smell, this smell. So we started doing, lime because of the smell and the old clay which is true. And the police officers even say that was a thing. And other neighbors did have the smell. I do think that obviously I believe he was active before that, but that from the first time he smelled that smell and knew it could be his cover, that he was planning on using that area as his burial ground.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that ultimately with Tim McCoy, who was his first victim, who
First
people
known victim.
first known victim, people ignorantly refer to as the Greyhound Boy. Um, he was the first kid that he had picked up outside of the Greyhound station that we know of, and he brought him back. Tim was traveling by bus. He was going back home to Iowa from where he had moved, I believe, up to Minnesota. And he had missed the last bus coming back from Iowa while he was heading back up home, and that's when Gacy got him, and that ended as we heard in episode 1 in the worst way possible for Tim McCoy. And ultimately Gacy, out of convenience at that point, at least in terms of the fact that he's married to Carol, who was his second wife, and she had 2 daughters. And you also had Carol's mother living in that house. Now, they were all gone that weekend, and Carol traveled a lot because her mother lived out of state and she would travel to see her mother all the time. So Gacy was alone a lot because he was married from 72 up until the beginning of 76 when he finalized the divorce with Carol. And after Carol's out of the house, that's when he goes absolutely berserk in terms of what he's known for by us at this point in time. And when Carol, so he's smelling it too. So when he puts Tim down there, and he doesn't do anything beyond just putting him down there, and he buries him in a shallow grave, Tim, his body starts to decay, and there is a smell at that point, and the smell is beyond that kind of clay, mildewy, kind of overwhelming smell. It's a terrible smell, and Carol's complaining about the smell down there. And she says that there's some kind of weird flies coming up through the dryer vent. So one day when Carol's not at home, he goes back down there and he lays a concrete pad over where Tim is buried. And he realizes at that point, this is what I can do. But he also figures out that there's a different way to mask the smell so that that's not going to be an issue moving forward. Because, as much as he claims that Tim McCoy, that he killed him in self-defense, at that point in time, if you're to believe, which I do not believe, and I have a big, kind of like ongoing debate with Bill Dorsch as to whether or not Gacy had done this prior to, I believe that he had. I don't necessarily believe that he had done it here in Illinois. I think that there's a strong probability that he had done it in Waterloo, Iowa. But he figures out, okay, there's going to be a way to mask the smell, and that's the lime, because the lime does mask the smell. And at that point, he starts spreading the lime down there. But that whole thing with those trenches that get dug down there, which ultimately are dug by a couple of kids that worked for Gacy, and that again is David Cram and Michael Rossi, who both lived with Gacy as well as working with him during the year of 1977 and 78, not at the same time, at 2 separate times. But common sense is going to dictate that these kids were living in the house. When I say kids, they're young men during Gacy's most active period of killing. And the thought that they were unaware of what was going on in that house is completely implausible to me. But ultimately I end up drilling down very hard in that on that concept in the podcast. I questioned Bill Kunkel, that lead prosecutor that we heard from tonight, at length about why Rob Peast, or I'm sorry, Michael Rossi and David Cram weren't arrested along with Gacy and charged as accomplices. And, Bill gives an answer. It's not an answer I definitely am going to ride with. I think that there were other reasons that they didn't charge those guys, but ultimately they end up calling both those guys at trial. And it's just it's a very, very deep dive into one of the most horrific, darkest periods of American history. So hopefully you guys will come along for the ride. That's
Yep.
what we
And
hope.
before we go, I just want to thank Kristen, who became a new member, new
Aw.
YouTube member,
Family hug.
while we were doing this live. And I want to thank Cody in Tennessee and Afton Ford and Nev for gifting Defense for gifting a nay. Sorry.
Afton has been a mod for so long.
I know. I can't believe I did that. I'm sorry, Afton.
That's terrible.
But everybody's names changed. I don't think it was
Yeah,
in
people
any
keep
event.
saying that their names are changing. Like
In any event, let's try to stay on track because this is getting turned into a podcast.
Well,
So,
so
and
this, right?
no, I think this we've been doing very good.
Okay. Well, I mean the thank yous. Like you can get rid of
Well,
that.
there's like 3 of them. So,
Okay.
and on the regular podcast, we thank the patrons.
It's true. It's true.
All right, but now he has to clean this up.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No.
Darren. So and nay for gifting Defense Diaries podcast memberships. We appreciate it all.
We do.
And we will continue to do this. We'll continue to decide how much beyond 3 based on viewership, comments of the replay crew. And after we drop the first episode behind the scenes on the audio podcast feeds, we'll see how those are being taken. And if they're getting a lot of views and people seem to like them, we'll continue to drop them there. So, but thank you all for being here with us. Thank you, everyone who's going to be in the replay crew. Thank you, members. Thank you, patrons.
Thank you, mods. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Mandy. And thank you guys, because without you, I'm just an old man.
Talking about an old case.
Talk to you next time.
Boop.